So, welcome to the latest in our series of CIPR Sport Group conversations. Each month, we talk to a special guest who gives us together stimulus for those working in sports communications, insights for those who might want to come into this world, and great advice for anyone across communications. We've spoken to Scott Field from GB Olympics, Drew Barrand, British Aquatics, football writer, broadcaster Henry Winter, Aoife Clark from the Irish FU, Craig Spence from the Paralympic movement, and more. And I'd urge you to go back and have a look at some of those if you haven't seen them. Today's guest is Jon Zerafa, who can give us some brilliant insights, I'm sure, into winning campaigns for staging global events, successful leadership and presidential campaigns across sport, and how communications, public affairs, and sport have evolved over 3 decades. He describes himself on LinkedIn as offering reputation management and campaign communications in the business of sport. And that's typically concise and pithy from Jon. He was co-founder of Vero Communications, where he worked on some of the biggest global campaigns in sport, from Olympic bids, World Cup bids, presidential, football club takeovers, and big reputational issues. He can describe, I'm sure, as we have the conversation, his career as we go. But along the way, he's advised UEFA, FA, the Premier League, UK Sport, UK Athletics, La Liga, World Sailing, and many more similar. And he's now a strategic advisor to Signify, who use AI, smart tech, and big data to police, catch, and change behaviors in online abuse, notably around sports stars, which is a very timely topic. So, Jon, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure, Chris. Hi, Scott.
Hi, Jon.
A very big question, but a simple one to start. How did it all begin?
Yeah, no, I do ask myself that quite often, on occasion. It started a bit more in politics, actually. My degree was in politics, and I always remember this even to today. In my last year, I read an article on a day in the life of a lobbyist, and I thought that sounds really, really interesting. So that's what I want to go and do and become. But actually ended up getting on a sales trainee program with GlaxoSmithKline in the interim, my first year out of uni, where I was selling Ribena out the back of the car, which didn't quite live up to expectations. There's a lesson there. But I'm glad I did it just for the hard graft. But it ended up getting a research job with an MP that then led to 5 years at a consultancy called Westminster Strategy, which back in the day was one of the leading lobbying agencies. And actually, that's where I first met Mike Lee, who was a great mentor of mine. We co-founded Vero together. And the way I get into sport actually was through Mike. We at Westminster Strategy, we ran the public affairs account for the Premier League.
Yeah.
And it was just in the days when the Premier League was setting up. That's why I've got grey hair that long ago. And they also wanted then to outsource their press office to us. So that was a real new element of experience for me, from public affairs to front-facing media and communications and press office role. So I always remember I had 2 phones on my desk. One was the sort of Westminster Strategy public affairs one, and the other was Premier League press office. So that's where I first cut my teeth into sport and media and communications and press relations. So that was the initial germination of my career.
And that's I remember where we first spoke and met in those early days of the Premier League. So how do you see now the Premier League having grown and developed when you think you were there in the very beginning?
I mean, credit to the Premier League. Obviously, it's become the global football soccer brand. It's incredible. They were very fortunate to have had Richard Scudamore as CEO for so many years. Chris, you would have known him through your Sky days, and just navigated the various egos and club chairmen and club owners brilliantly. And that's no easy feat. But they're going into some difficult territorial waters, already are, with regards to Man City and that case, which should become public in the coming months, which could unleash all sorts of reputational challenges going forwards for football.
And that approach, Jon, which you mentioned, with bringing us, bringing public affairs and communications together in one place. How common was that at the time, or was that new? Was that a new approach in sport? And what were the benefits of that, do you think?
Yeah, no, it was totally new, Scott. And a very brave decision. It was Rick Parry actually that was the driver for this back in the day. He was close to Mike, and to bring public affairs and media together in that way in a very solidified sort of contractual relationship was great. I mean, you both know there's a very strong relationship and correlation between what you're saying to the media and what you're saying to the politicians, what you're saying to the regulator, what are you saying to decision makers. All those elements, it's so important to be joined up. And back in the 90s, early 2000s, it was far less joined up than it is today, I'd say.
And I guess in a joined up digital world, it's become more common because essentially it's the same audience in many cases. So your government minister is getting his news from the same place as the general public, right?
No, exactly. And actually, I said it's got a lot more joined up, but actually, there are many organisations that don't get the joined upness, and they're still operating in silos. But I mean, Chris is nodding. I know we're on the same page on this, and I'm sure Scott, we are too. You've got to ensure that symmetry across all those key organisations to ensure consistency of message. There's obviously a slight flex. If you're talking to the public, that's slightly different than if you're talking to a politician or a regulator, but the core sort of themes about what you're saying, what you're trying to communicate, that there's got to be a consistency.
So when you're
Yeah.
looking at key messages, the audience you want to get to, the channels you reach them. If you're looking at a successful events bid, how would you traditionally coordinate those different audiences?
No, it's a good question, Chris. I mean, I was so lucky. I mean, my first major event project was the London 2012 Olympics, where I was brought in to head up the political communications of the bid. And London was just fascinating because I think it's the first time in major event bidding where there was this idea that you needed to create a really powerful narrative and story. And that wasn't just to communicate to the decision makers, so in this case, the IOC members. But that time you've got to remember in the UK that Scott will know this because he was a member of the media. Yeah, a deeply cynical British media. No chance we've got of winning an Olympic bid. Politicians were deeply cynical. So, and the public was deeply cynical, actually. So it was about trying to engineer a story, a narrative that brought all of those competing but joined up influencers, decision makers together with a story that made sense to them. And sometimes that story would overlap. It would overlap with the IOC and British politicians and the UK media and the public, but sometimes it would need to be elevated up depending on who you were speaking to. Sorry, Chris, in terms of how you'd organise it. So, I mean, again, you'd have a sort of a core bid team, multidiscipline across that. So you'd obviously have the media and comms on one side, public affairs, decision maker outreach, marketing, and then on the other, you'd have sort of the technical infrastructure side of a bid, stadiums, logistics, all that sort of stuff. And one of the tricks in all of this is meshing those two together. So you give the dryness of the technical a little bit of sizzle, and then maybe you try and inject a little bit of passion and sizzle into the non-technical. Why London, why us? In the case of London 2012.
And then you were there for the bid team and the winning of the bid, which must have been an amazing moment. And then the role changed into being part of the build-up. How would you characterize those two different sort of campaigns?
They're very, very different. I mean, the part of the bookend that I love is the campaign. For me, that's always been, and I've been very fortunate to work on some really big campaigns since. It's great because you know what you're trying to achieve. You've got a very clear timeline and a very clear end goal. But obviously, once you win, in the case of an Olympic Games or a World Cup, you'll have 7 or 8 years until the actual events. It goes from a very sort of sexy campaign, global campaign, to suddenly an infrastructure project with many years to come. That's a little bit grayer, albeit, of course, very, very important. And the real sizzle doesn't really kick in until maybe 1 to 2 years before you hold the event. So that's partly why Mike and I took the decision to leave London 2012 after we led, to continue the sizzle of campaigning.
Although it always feels on campaigns, there's excitement of winning, and then it feels like there are going to be several years perhaps with UK media, where people are looking for the problems or the holes or the construction issues. Actually, is that, I guess that's the same on all event bids, is it? You have that period where it becomes shifts.
Yeah, there's a shift. I mean, obviously depends whether you're in a Western free media society or a more sort of controlled one where the criticism might be slightly less and the questions might be slightly less forensic. Uh, but certainly in, Western media, exactly right, Chris, you have that sort of crescendo of great, we won, amazing. And then as the months tick by, you'll have budget issues, you'll have infrastructure issues, you'll have delays, which is all part of the beast. I mean, it's interesting with LA now, looking ahead to the LA Olympics, because so much of their infrastructure is already in place. Those sort of infrastructure issues are far less. You've still got some budget issues kicking around, but yeah. So how have you explained it is pretty much how it works, at least in the Western free liberal
And
media.
in terms of the event bids that you've worked on, John, and what were the common areas where there was that you got right for each of those? What if you were, without giving away too much, what are the what are the three things you need for a successful bid?
It's power of the story, power of the narrative. Why us? Why London? Why Qatar? Why whatever? Why Paris? And you've got to answer that question in the eyes of the decision makers. So whether it's the IOC or the FIFA electorate or a presidential campaign, so you need to understand the audience. Quite often they'll have many different there'll be a lot of different views and issues kicking around. But once you properly understand the audience and the institution that's making the decision, you're in a much better place then to think, okay, well, what we can offer is this. It speaks to the IOC on across these three or four levels. So again, I don't want to sort of live in the past, but for London 2012, obviously Sebco and the team made a great play on inspiring the youth of the world to engage with Olympic sport. At that time, and it's still the case actually, Olympic sport and the viewership of Olympic sport is getting older and older and older. And there was a creative sort of discussion within the bid 2 months or so before we won, where London, because of where it's sat in terms of global media, it's young, dynamic. London breakdown of the London population, there's a story there around re-engaging the youth of the world through a London-based Olympics. And so, as I say, it's understanding your audience, creating a compelling story. The other thing is about being utterly focused. Only do the things that you feel are going to deliver votes. So that you need to be utterly disciplined. And I think the sort of the impact of that on the bid team is everybody does become really, really focused, and there's a very clear goal at the end of the timeline about what you're trying to achieve.
Which is the joy of working on campaigns. There's a defined outcome, which you don't always have in communications. Sometimes your wins are harder to define. And I mean, I know you don't want to go back to London 2012, but it was an extraordinary period because of the transformative effect it had, I think, in terms of the whole sector in the UK.
Yeah.
And certainly it shaped a lot of careers, certainly mine. But take us inside, though, I don't know, the last 7 days before the bid decision in Singapore. Uh, how confident were you all that you got it, or how much of it was still in play in that last 7 days?
I think growing confidence. I mean, that's the other thing. You've got to have belief in what
Mm.
you're doing. I'd say in that last 7 days, the bid team was feeling very confident, but certainly knew that work still needed to be done. I mean, in my sort of political role, if you look at Tony Blair being on the ground and the number of one-on-one meetings he had in that last 48 hours, utilizing his wife, Cherie Blair, utilizing Beckham, it was a proper military operation, that last sort of 72 hours in Singapore. Um, And you don't leave anything to chance. And this is the case for all the major bids that I've worked on, and the ones that haven't worked for various reasons. But quite often it's because there isn't that utter focus and military precision and dynamism all the way through to the end.
Yeah, and I think again the other as well as comms not having sometimes not having those definable outcomes, there's also there always does feel like a risk of mission creep as well. You know, you want to you're not you want to try and fix the world rather than just do the thing that's in front of you. You know.
Yeah, and actually, Scott, the other thing is in terms of comms and these bids, quite often the messaging that the comms department or comms leads strategists would come up with would quite often that messaging would be used by senior leadership speaking to decision makers. So it goes back to what I was saying earlier. There's got to be a consistency of message with what's being given to the media, all the way through to decision makers and the ultimate decision makers.
The other thing that strikes me there, and I probably three of us will violently agree on this with all our backgrounds, but how communication is core to that actual operation when you have a campaign. It's not seen as functional or separate, which is another one of the joys of a campaign approach.
Totally, Chris. I think you're absolutely right. There are very few projects that I've worked on where, as you say, comms isn't absolutely front and center in a bid situation, because unless you get your messaging and your story and the ways that you're going to communicate right, you're dead. You don't have a
Yeah.
chance. So you're absolutely right in that sense.
So is it very similar when you've worked on presidential bids? I know Brian Cookson is one, for example, with the UCI. Do they work in a very similar way, or what are the differences there?
They are similar in some senses. So, as I say, the power of story, the power of narrative, understanding the decision makers and the voters, and that drive and energy and utter focus. Where they're different ultimately, and Scott knows this. As I say, we worked together on the Brian Cookson UCI back in what 12, 13 years ago. At the end of the day, it comes down to the individual. And I would say, I mean, this is partly true in major event bids where the top two, three, four, five people that are liaising with the decision makers, you've got to have that chemistry, you've got to have that drive. But if you're running for FIFA president or World Athletics president, it's about connection. It's about being able to work a room. It's about being able to ask questions about that person's child or grandchildren, or where they went to college, or what's the latest conversation you had with them. And I mean, two of the most impressive campaigners on the presidential field I ever worked with was Gianni Infantino for FIFA and Seb Coe for World Athletics. And they shared a number of things. They were absolute, their energy levels were off the charts. So they would travel and travel and travel, meet multiple decision makers in a very short space of time. And it's like they just got out of bed. It's incredible. So that's certainly one of the key ingredients for presidential campaigns is that drive, motivation, and the ability to connect at an individual level, which is slightly less important at major bid strategy, but still important.
And is that you think that's been a constant and remains a constant?
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. I work with Laura McAllister, who's now UEFA vice president, on her campaign for that position, and it was during COVID actually. So she had to do all of her meetings with decision makers through Zoom, and actually it worked really well and probably to her advantage because she was able to maximize her time, not traveling to 40 odd different countries, meeting 50 odd different people, but she could do a lot of this through Zoom. So technology's changed things. But at the end of the day, you can't beat pressing the flesh and sitting eye to eye with somebody and building that rapport.
Yeah,
And that's the same for major events as well as for individuals. Sorry, Scott.
no, it's okay. I was just going to say I well remember the schedule that you had Brian on for the UCI campaign, and that was pretty tough. But one of the other things I do also recall from that period was the time investment that you were encouraging in building credibility and momentum. And I don't mean that Brian wasn't a credible candidate, but that he or a credible individual. but that had a credible chance to challenge the incumbent, which was Pat McQuaid at the time. And I think even the first media day that we had in London, a lot of the off-book conversations journalists were having with us was, but yeah, has Brian really got a shot at this? And I think a lot of the investment I do recall us making, and this may be something that happened in other campaigns as well, is this guy, if I vote for this guy, has he got an actual shot? Yeah.
Totally. No, you're right, Chris, because as we know, people like to back winners.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the other thing I haven't mentioned, which I should, is momentum. Momentum is so key in these campaigns, whether it's presidential or global events. You've got to time your activity and your energy right across a long timeline, but you want it to be maximizing and crescendoing at that final finish. And so you want to be written about in the media as a potential real candidate. But you also want the decision makers to be chatting in the bars and to be chatting in meetings. Oh, yes, I met so and so. Actually, really impressive. So that's why that sort of dual strategy is so important and
It's
build that momentum and belief.
as you're talking these through, I know I've got a visual brain, but I can see charting and mapping the process of a campaign. But is it also, whether it's an event or an individual? I'm thinking of House of Cards, and where do you literally map it out and you're thinking where are the votes coming from and where are you going to apply influence? It's very much like that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, in a lot of these decisions, you've got, 50 to 200 decision makers. So you can do that. It's not like a general election where you're trying to map 30 million votes. You're literally mapping 50 to 200 votes. So you're looking at, you're understanding that voter. What are their buttons? What are their issues? But you're also potentially thinking about who are the two or three core people around them who might have an influence in how they're thinking. So it's a classic sort of onion strategy. That sort of the bullseye in the middle is the voter, but who are the third parties and the other people or organisations who might have an influence on them, either directly or indirectly.
And that influence is still very much about connections. I mean, polling and general elections, it's very different here. You have to know those people and have the insight and the information to really be able to track it. So connection,
Yeah.
communication is cool.
Yeah, and I know in London we have this, and it's been used subsequently, this sort of triangulation. So when you get a piece of intel back from a voter, for example, try and triangulate it with at least two other sources to verify that it's true. And also never believe anybody that says I'm going to vote for you, unless you hear it from a third party.
And I don't think we can move very much further, John, without a word on Mike, if you're okay with that, because he was such an extraordinary figure in British sport. Certainly, I still think about some of the stuff that I learned working with you and Mike. But yeah, he was the definition of larger than life, wasn't he?
And totally. I mean, actually, it'd be 7 years, I think, next month since he passed. And I first came across Mike, I think it was 1994. So he gave me my job at Westminster Strategy. So that's where we first met. So what's that? 30 plus years. Our sort of careers interwoven.
Hmm.
He helped bring me into the Olympic bid, and then obviously Vero. He had and Chris. Well, you both work with him and myself. One of the biggest brains you could ever meet, but his instincts were just unparalleled. He had this sort of sixth sense just to read the room. Incredibly good with media, incredibly good with message development, incredibly good at just cutting through the mess and saying, he was no waffle with him. You both know this. I learned a huge amount through Mike, and I know you might come onto this at the end of the interview about lessons learned. But if you can, you know, step onto the coattails of somebody really, really smart, you can learn so much. And we worked really well together because our personalities were a little bit different and our sort of skill sets were slightly different. So wasn't easy at times. He was obviously quite a strong character, but a dynamic, energized, super smart guy. So obviously a real loss to the comms world when he passed.
He was, yeah. And I
Right,
think
it felt,
your
it felt,
your your
sorry.
point, sorry, Chris, your point about instinct is a really good one. We all led much more data informed lives, and that in communications, and that's absolutely right. But I think this actually might have come up in a conversation with Scott Field as well, is you do need to mix that with a certain level of gut. What is your gut telling you?
Totally. I mean, I do a lot more now with data, but my default position still is gut. It's still gut. If the data can verify it, fine, but I'm still a gut person, and that certainly was what Mike was as well. So
I was going to say, I hope this is true for you, John, but it felt that Mike was able to find the simplicity, the core truth in a world of real complexity. And then he was able to say unpopular things to people in power.
totally. Absolutely, and that's part of the role of a good consultant is to say things that might be difficult for the other side of the table to hear, and that was certainly actually one of the Vero sort of DNAs, as it were. We were willing to say things that might be a little bit uncomfortable for the client, because unless you're willing to do that, you're not offering value. You're just not.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked in-house all my comms career. As John said, I was a journalist before that, but yeah, that working in-house, part of the reason why you want external voices is
Yeah.
to give you a poke, or someone else in the organization to give them a poke. Yeah.
And sometimes to say the things you're struggling to say inside.
Indeed. I've done that on more than one occasion. Yeah. Yeah.
And John, we were talking recently how the staging of events seems to change. So a few years ago, let's say 20 years ago, you'd think of America as being a simple place to stage an Olympics or stage a World Cup. When you look now at the US staging an Olympics and a World Cup, it feels slightly different. There are other challenges around.
That's probably the most diplomatic I've ever heard Trump's America and sport being described, Chris. Oh my God! I mean, you couldn't make it up. I mean, in a way, I love it because it sort of meshes my politics hat with sport and the politics of sport. It's incredible. Um, we've obviously got the World Cup in just under a year, which will be fascinating. Everything from fan visas to law and order to Trump trying to be center stage at every which way he can. Um, heat's going to be a big issue. We saw it in the Club World Cup, and then 3 years from now we've got the LA Games, and actually that will be really fascinating because literally pretty much as the sun comes down on LA, the Republican Party will be choosing its candidate to fight the election, and Trump will be this lame duck president, and who knows how his brain's going to be at that time. But I was thinking about this when you think about, for example, when Beijing hosted the Olympic Games, when Russia hosted the World Cup in 2018. Putin and the Chinese leadership were almost invisible. They wanted to downplay the political strength and might of those countries. I always remember being in Russia for 2018. It was seen as a warm and friendly place. That this sort of idea that Putin was going to have a very iron fist over everything, it was sanitized. Whereas what we're seeing in America now is all the things that you look for in a major event, be it a warm welcome, friendly, hospitable, um, bringing people together, making the world closer. Trump is the opposite of that, it seems, and but FIFA and the IOC have just got to work with that, live with it, and navigate it as best they can.
I was thinking as well that, correct me if I'm wrong, I read recently that the biggest financial supporters of global events are not actually the brands who in a way get all of the glory. It's actually government, whether it be local government or national government, through funding and through staging agreements. Although everyone always thinks it's the brands. And maybe particularly in the Anglo-American axis, where there's pressure on economy, on what level of services should be provided, on taxation. whether that level of funding is now something that's being tested more on the Anglo-American axis.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we've seen with Saudi and 34 World Cup, the power of the Middle East. We're seeing Qatar bid for 2036 Olympic Games. Um, post-COVID and post the financial crash, without question, Western governments, Western nations are less able to bankroll these major events. Obviously, the Olympic Games has tried to move and pivot, and that's why existing infrastructure is so important to try and lessen the cost, which is generally a good move. But obviously, the downside of that, when you go to a city that's already got the vast amount of its infrastructure in place, is the legacy impact is much less. One of the great things about London, I think the sporting legacy was probably less so, but as we all know, anybody that goes to the East End of London now in Stratford, that city, that part of the city is totally revolutionized because of London. So, there is a strange dynamic there. In terms of the US, I mean, we've just seen this with LA. They've just introduced naming rights for their venues. So the IOC has gone from clean venues to now sponsored venues. So that's quite a switch. Again, it's just the reality of economic reality and the importance of revenue.
And I suppose one of the side benefits of from a communications point of view in terms of a venue building program is you have staging posts in the build up to an event that you can build a communications plan around. And I think London 2012, Jackie and Joanna, that team did a really good job of that, of building that idea of momentum. And we've opened this venue and this venue, and we've done this here, and if everything's built already, you have sort of in a very basic way, much less to announce, and that's a communications challenge in itself, right? Because you lose that narrative drive.
It's a good point, Scott. No, absolutely. As you say, if you're in an organizing committee and you've got 7 years to go, you'll look at the infrastructure map and you look at the milestones and what we can announce when. Exactly right. If you've got 95% of your infrastructure already built, you're sort of the bullets are far, far less in your back pocket to use from a comms perspective. And that matters because there's less excitement within the domestic market, within the international market. I mean, going slightly off topic, but I always found it slightly strange that the IOC moved away from a really competitive bid process for the Olympic Games, because one of the upsides of running global campaigns for subsequent Olympic Games was you kept interest, you kept global interest in the Olympic Games outside of the 4-year cycle. So I think there was a comms upside for running sort of these global contests.
Yeah, I think as well the and but this is the reality we need to face into, isn't it, really, in international sport, I think, in terms of and communications people should just deal with the world as it is rather than how we would like it to be, is then going into a North American or an American Olympic Games, an American World Cup, is if the context is shifting away from the things that were important 10 years ago, then what is the new context that we're working in? There's much less about, for example, diversity and inclusion and much less emphasis on sustainability. What are the new things that we should be talking about in the build-up to an American Games?
Well, I mean, it's interesting if you look at Saudi and winning the 34 FIFA World Cup.
Mm.
They've got a very powerful narrative around embrace, openness, youthfulness, dynamism. And you can see why they're doing that, because what Saudi's trying to achieve there is marry its global country plan for the next several decades and sort of overlay it on the FIFA World Cup. It's a win-win, because a lot of the country narrative works for a FIFA World Cup narrative.
Mm.
And it's much more a sort of an external dynamism that they're trying to drive here. Whereas Trump, for all of his political, thought process, is much more inward looking, and his support base is much more inward looking. So it's so weird that hosting these two global events in the US, the Olympics and the World Cup, it's all about welcoming the world and being outward looking, are diametrically opposed to where Trump is and his political base is politically. The two just don't work together. And we're sort of seeing that. But it is what it is, as you say, Scott. And Gianni Infantino in particular is playing Trump really well. He's getting some criticism for it, but what's the alternative? He's got his ear and he's going to make stuff happen to make the tournament work. There's a win-win for both sides to make it work. It has to work. And same for the Olympics.
It's really interesting, whether it's London 2012 or Saudi in the World Cup, that simultaneously you have you're communicating to a local audience about the value that it brings, but at the same time you're talking to an international audience about the value of working with that country in a very similar way with Qatar or Saudi Arabia. But what's the message for the US around the Olympics and the World Cup to the outside world?
It's difficult, Chris. I mean, the Olympics has got the added complication that it's a democratic state and it's a democratic governor. And as I say, I think it's fascinating. Who knows where the next 3 years are going to go politically in the US? But if Trump and the Republicans do start to hit some bumps in the road, maybe you might see LA become a little bit more politicized on the Democratic side. At the moment, yeah, that's unlikely, but who knows? As I say, Trump will become a lame duck president. He'll have what, another 4 months to run come the Olympics to be in power. I think that's much less likely for the World Cup, but Trump will absolutely want the World Cup to be a success, because he enjoys football. I think his son Barron is a big soccer fan. He's very close to Gianni, as I said, and yeah, the tournament's not going to be simple. It's a big logistical challenge. And as I say, visa applications are going to be really complex because you're going to have fans coming from dozens and dozens and dozens of countries into a country that's trying to pull down the barriers, literally. So that's going to need some careful management. And I suspect we'll see some quite tricky stories emerge about maybe fans being turned away or struggling to get visas. But I think of the two events, I think the Olympics is potentially more interesting. I say because of the Democrat dynamic and the fact that Trump will be on his last 3 or 4 months.
Where else would you like to see or could see or even enjoy the challenge of a campaign, an Olympics or a World Cup being? I mean, it strikes me India is 1 in 8 of the people on the planet, billion people, but there's never been a major global event. So where else could you see those things happening?
Well, I mean, take the Olympic Games 2036. We know that the two main candidates are India and Qatar, and both have some strengths and both have some weaknesses. I mean, I think India in particular has some quite challenging logistical challenges, as well as some societal challenges, actually, that haven't really been dug into. But as you say, if India was ever cracked, it's a great, huge market. You've got to wonder whether it's a little bit too cricket skewered. How much genuinely is there a wider sport love there? But again, they can flip that and a bit like London did, turn it into the opportunity for the IOC to really grow the Indian sports market across the 26, 28 Olympic sports. Qatar, in that sense, has got the challenge of very small, very, very small domestic population and the heat issue, but that's navigable with a slight change of calendar. So that race is going to be fascinating from a comms perspective because the sort of things that I've just mentioned will be going through the heads of the IOC members. And now that the IOC has a new president in Kirsty Coventry, it looks like she's going to give a little bit more power to the IOC members in terms of sanctioning the decision for the 2036 host city, which will be decided in the next 1 to 2 years. So in a sense, comms around Olympic bids is becoming a little bit more center stage now after having a decade or so off.
And in terms of putting your public affairs hat back on, John, what thinking about British organisations and British governing bodies, I suppose, over the next 10, 15 years, that cycle that we're looking at where we've got 2 mega events in the US, we've got a Saudi Arabian World Cup, and then beyond that, potentially an Indian or a Qatari Olympics. What if you were? What are the opportunities there, I guess, for those British governing bodies, those as Chris says, which are being supported by public funds in the UK?
It's a good question, Scott. So I would imagine part of the sort of the Saudi strategy, Qatar strategy, Indian strategy is to think what I was saying earlier, the onion ring. How can we help get to voters in a sort of slightly more circuitous route? And
Hmm.
one of the ways to do that is through either international sports federations and funding agreements, support agreements, hosting agreements. But you could also micro that all the way down to national governing body level. So whether it's with the British Olympic Association, whether it's with key federations, national governing bodies here in the UK, who are deemed to have some influence at the international level with the decision makers. So that might be, I don't know, training camps, it might be talent exchange programs, it might be knowledge share, it might be sponsorship deals. So I think there's an interesting suite of opportunities for UK national governing bodies to tap into Saudi, Qatar, India.
Hmm.
That's a win-win for both sides.
Interesting.
Um, can you tell us a bit more about, I mean, obviously a big reputational topic at the moment, a big communication topic around abuse and online abuse, and it's come through in lots of different ways around particularly around football this year. But could you just explain a bit about your role with Signify and perhaps how your communications and public affairs careers sort of helped with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it got involved about 6 years ago. I knew the chairman, personal friend of mine, and it's great because it's been a new venture for me, and I've learned so much, and it's made me realize even more that I love being involved in startups. I'm not a big organization person. I love the smaller teams, and I love the ability to really make a difference in those smaller teams. And I always remember I sat down with the founders of Signify, and they had an ambition to get into sport. And at that time, the online abuse thing, we didn't really have the capability to sell. It was like a germination of an idea. But I always remember we sat down and our client screen was blank, totally blank. And then we said, well, who are the clients ultimately we'd like to get hold of over the next 3 to 5 years? And if you look at our client list now, it's totally blue chip in the world of global sport. The way that business has developed has been just a joy to sort of see and be involved in. Um, I mean, where they're really successful is that they're leaders in protecting athletes and officials from online abuse. So obviously, it's a little bit of a zeitgeist sort of moment. They've got great tech, but actually, what's really driving the company, and this is very important to me getting involved, is it's not just about identifying the stuff, it's about trying to drive change. So, for example, one of our long-term clients is Arsenal. We worked with Arsenal for 4 seasons now, I think. And Arsenal are great in terms of using our data and insights and proof. And they've banned about 30 to 35 season ticket holders or club members over the last 3 seasons who have abused online Arsenal players. And what we've seen is that's significantly reduced the amount of abuse that Arsenal fans give to their own team. So imagine if you could replicate that right across the Premier League, it would be really, really powerful. We work with the NCAA. The work that we've done is helping change legislation in the US around what we call prop bets, these micro bets, because betting is a big trigger for online abuse towards athletes. We see it a lot in tennis. So, I mean, I've got this, and I think we might see some movement on this in the next year or two, where sport as a whole can come together, whether it's at the IF level or the NGB level, because we're able to identify a lot of these abusers. And if they can go on a global database of fans that aren't allowed to attend live sport, it's another deterrent. Imagine that database was shared with subscription TV companies. They weren't allowed to subscribe to Sky or Disney or whatever. So the way to change behaviors is partly the carrot, show what's good practice, but it's also stick, saying that you can't hide, behind a keyboard. Well, rugby, for example, has been amazing in this through our work with them, Signify. I think it's led to about 5 prosecutions globally of people that have abused online, and that includes down in Australia and New Zealand. So again, it's showing what's possible. And the other thing I'd say about this is the sport right across the piece, from the IOC down, international sports federations are really seeing this now as a priority. That it's about protecting their key assets if they spend millions of investment in. So there's been a real shift, and I've really enjoyed it, seeing how the business has grown, and as I say, being at the basement level and seeing things develop.
It's very interesting the way you talk about the how that's influencing changing behaviors. It's technology that's changing behavior. Can you see, in your experience, other ways in which constant evolution of technology has changed the way that either the channels or the ways of communicating or the effectiveness of communication, and how those have come into your mix?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we're all trying to be across this, aren't we? But the way social has developed, I'm sure we all remember the days when everything was much more straight media focused. Then you had the importance of a website, and then you had the emergence of various digital channels. It's incredibly, it's multifaceted, isn't it, in terms of social channels? But again, it's the importance of consistency of message, but having the ability to understand the nuance between an Instagram user, a TikTok user. It's not my area of expertise by any stretch. I probably learn more from my kids than I do professionally. But it's just become a lot more complex, a little bit like society, actually. Um, a lot more attention has been narrowed. Things become a lot more pithy, which I sort of quite like, particularly at the consumer level. And it's a lot much more dynamic and fast moving. And actually, going back to Signify, I mean, X is still the platform where online abuse happens most in live sport, because most people still engage with live sport through X more than any other social channel.
So do you think, maybe an impossible question, a comms campaign for London 2012 in this era, are there ways in which social and digital AI would change the way, or is it at the basis you're still looking for the simple trigger and to map out how to get influence to win the bid? So it's all different, but actually it's basically the same.
Think on these campaigns, whether it's major event or presidential, I still think that personal engagement, the power of message, that's key. Where you're running campaigns that are much more consumer focused, then obviously the impact of social media is so much more important. But obviously social becomes very important when you've won the event and you need to sell tickets, you need to sell merchandise, then absolutely social becomes into its own. But in terms of winning campaigns, the social is still down the pecking order a little bit.
I was sorry to take a bit of a right turn here, or a sharp turn, John, Chris, but I was struck by what you said about the NCAA work with Signify and how that had enabled legislation um, to change. I suppose one of the things that I've seen is the difficulty sports have and so, especially when it comes down to individual clubs or individual associations, is engaging with the big social media platforms, so X, Instagram, and asking them to work differently has been a challenge in the past, I suppose. Is that something you've seen with your work on Signify?
Yes, I mean, Signify are great in that they've got very good working relationships right across the
Mm.
platforms, and that they do react to the most egregious abuse we send them, and they're generally pretty good. But at the end of the day, these social media platforms, the ethos of their founders and the ethos still is that they see themselves as free speech platforms. And any intervention to stop that, and Trump is a good example, and MAGA is a good example, and we're seeing this here in the UK with the right wing media. Any excuse to try and intervene in a sort of public narrative is seen as stopping free speech. But these West Coast platforms in the US, they're driven by free speech. So there's a real challenge between trying to moderate and create nicer environments online and their ethos to drive freedom of speech. And that's part of the challenge. And the other challenge for these platforms is they are so gigantic, and they're dealing with so many issues. Um, Sometimes it's you might think this sounds silly, but sometimes technically it's quite difficult to act because a lot of what Signify does is in the nuance. You know, they work across 50 different languages. So what might be abusive in one language is not culturally abusive in another. You know,
Interesting.
it's really not a simple science.
Very interesting.
Scott, I know you always like to have a certain killer final question.
Yes. So I mean, I think, I, I, and I know, John, you're very future focused, so we didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about your early career, but I feel like we probably could have uh, had more on that. And certainly maybe with a glass of wine extracted some stories from you as well, John. But I think one of the things we like to ask our guests is the Kirsty Young question, which is if you could go back and talk to the Jon Zerafa who had escaped from selling Ribena out of the back of a car, um, and had embarked on a career in public affairs and communications. What piece of advice would you give your younger self?
Question, Scott. I'll give three. Take risks. So I quit my Ribena job without having a job to go to. Um, and I was lucky in that I then got my MP research job within 3 or 4 months. So take risks. Don't be afraid to take risks. Identify, this sounds a little bit Machiavellian, but it's so true. Identify in your early career and all the way through who are the senior leaders in your organization that you want to impress. You know, from board member down, because you want to work with the best people because they tend to be the smartest. But more than that, they're the ones that will decide whether you're going to get promoted or not. They're the ones that are going to decide how much salary increase you're going to get, and ultimately, they might be the ones that might want to be poaching you in some years to come as they move into different directions. So, identify seniors who you work with who you think I got to get in with those guys for all the reasons that I've just listed. I think just have fun, you know, and don't. I know it's such a cliche term, but don't sweat the small stuff. But time goes so fast, as I'm sure we all know, as we sort of get past our mid stage. Um, have fun and really appreciate every moment that you're working, particularly on the bigger stuff. I mean, I like you guys, I've been really fortunate to have done some really wonderful, exciting work in my career that I'm really proud of. But when you're in the moment, it's difficult sometimes to take that in. So take it in, have fun, take risks, and identify some really smart people that can help in your career.
Well, I think they're three things that would take you quite a long way, John. I think actually the one that's probably easiest to forget is the first one about taking risks. I think especially early in your career, um, your room to maneuver is probably quite a lot bigger than certainly I realized at the time. Anyway, I think well, I'd have yeah taken more risks. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, in fact, Scott, it reminds me. I mean, I left my Westminster strategy job at the age of 30, again, without any job. I took 6 months out to travel. And I remember it was in the early-ish days of email. And I was in my last month, 6 weeks out, where it was in Asia or somewhere. I was emailing headhunters, setting
Right.
up interviews for when I got back. So, and it all worked out fine. But you need to be a bit planned, but take the risk.
Something that really
Indeed.
strikes me running through the conversation is your constant curiosity. So we've talked about how things are changing and keep on changing, but it's really evident in the way you're talking about AI and Signify, for example, that the constant curiosity, always looking for the new ways, but actually at the very fundamentals of having a story, telling a story, who to connect with, why you're looking to influence, are just a common theme. So you need to have the very strong principles, but also be very open to change. And I think often we're very guilty of saying nothing, everything's always the same or everything's always changing. I love the way that you fuse those two.
Yeah, I go back to, we talked about Mike and gut. I'm still a gut person. I think probably we all are on this call, more than maybe data driven. You've got to believe in what you say. Yeah, I still, as you say, Chris. I mean, I love. I'm inquisitive. I love. Well, actually, I used to be less open to change. Actually, the older I've gotten, I'm more open to change.
Yeah.
Actually, which is, I
Hmm.
guess, a little bit strange. That might be another tip, Scott. Is don't be scared of change
Yes.
and embrace change. It's you shouldn't fear it. You should embrace it. Um,
I think you had some violent agreement from 3 people at the same time there saying, as you go through the career, it's very tempting that people think you become less curious or more. The further you go, the more curious you are, and the more you want to learn from other people, and the more you want to keep challenging.
I think, Chris, if you don't continue to be curious, you're gonna whittle away. So curiosity is another one to add to the list, I think.
So as we went through this conversation, as we wrap up, I'm glad Scott didn't challenge me as usual to try and wrap up the whole conversation, but I wrote down some key words along the way, and it turned out all of them seem to begin with C. Don't worry. Around joined up communication, communication at the core, the joy of a campaign, something you're aiming for, having a core message, that feeling of change and curiosity. So this has been a fascinating conversation. We should have done it in several parts. But thank you so much for
Thank you, John,
for joining us for this. And we will, as usual, this will be put on the website and circulated with a newsletter, and we urge you to sign up for the newsletter, look back at some previous conversations. But this has been absolutely fascinating, John. So thank you very much for your time, insight, and wisdom.
No, pleasure. And I've known you guys for some time, and we've worked on and off together on various inclinations, and I appreciate the opportunity to chat. So thank you.